Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again with another video. Today I'm sharing with you tips and troubleshooting tricks for using Archer & Olive's Acrylograph pens. I'm creating this video in collaboration with Archer & Olive to bring you as much information as possible so you can get the best out of your acrylographs. Thank you to Archer & Olive for sending me these pens and for sponsoring this video. I do have an ongoing relationship with Archer & Olive and am part of their design team. This video is not a review of the acrylographs, though I'm sure there will be a lot of overlapping information because y'all know me, I like to be really detailed, and I am going to give all of that basic information as well. So if you're on the fence about getting these pens, this video may help you in your decision, but really this video is aimed at those who already have acrylographs and are looking to get the most out of them. So first things first, let's get into the basics. Archer & Olive acrylograph pens are non-toxic, water-based acrylic ink paint pens, intended for use on white, black, and craft paper. The acrylographs are currently sold in sets of 10, 8 unique colors, plus a white pen and a clear blender pen. All of the color sets are available in both large and small nib sizes. The large nib size is 3mm and the small nib size is 0.7mm. The sets that are currently available are Primary, Jewel, Tropical, and the two newest sets, which were just released earlier this week, Cool Fall and Warm Fall. Each set retails for $35 US, which breaks down to $3.50 per pen. Each set of acrylographs comes in a storage box with instructions, a blending palette, and 2 extra replacement nibs. The packaging is plastic-free, and the barrel itself is recyclable. Archer & Olive is also currently working on making the pens refillable, which would be an awesome step forward in the sustainability and affordability of these pens moving forward. And of course, if you're shopping for acrylographs, you can get a discount with my affiliate code PBB10 for 10% off. With every purchase using my code, I make a small commission, so you can get a discount and support me at the same time. So now that we have the basic information out of the way, I want to jump into talking about general tips for using these pens. Starting with activation, the acrylographs, like all paint pens, require activation before each use. The first activation will take the longest, and subsequent activations should be much quicker. If you want the best results from your acrylographs, you have to activate them each and every single time you use them. No ifs, ands, or buts. With the cap on, shake the pen vigorously up and down vertically. As tempting as it is to not always put the cap back on when you're shaking the pen to activate it, please put the cap on every single time. When you don't, you are risking ink splashing out of the pen, and I don't want that for you. The reason for this is that on the pen head, there's a pump, and once you've used the pen before, there will be a little bit of ink in that pen head where there is a little storage area for ink. If the cap is not on and you're shaking it in this state, you may find that ink will splash out of the tip of the pen. As I mentioned, the first time that you activate it, it's going to take the longest amount of time, and that's because there will be no ink in that little storage ink area. So you're going to have to shake a lot longer that first time that you activate the pen. I would suggest at least 20 seconds to start, though I do find some of the pens take a little bit longer than that. Once you've shaken the pen vigorously for at least 20 seconds, you're going to want to press the tip of the pen gently against the blending palette until the ink flows. Gentle being the operative word, as pressing too hard may flatten or damage the nib. You should only have to push a few times gently for the ink to flow. If it's not flowing after a few gentle presses, put the cap back on and shake more before trying again. When you're reactivating a pen that has already had that initial activation, it doesn't take nearly as much effort. In my experience, just a shake of a few seconds and 1 or 2 presses of the nib against the blending palette is enough to get the ink flowing again. Now let's talk about storage. Once you're done using an acrylograph pen, gently wipe off any excess ink from the tip using either a rag or a paper towel. Close the cap firmly and then store the pens horizontally. You don't need to rinse the nib with water between uses. If you need to clean the blending palette, all you need is a rag or paper towel and some warm water. Wipe off the ink and then allow it to dry. Let's talk about best practices for general use. Yes, I'm going to reiterate this yet again. Please activate your pens between each and every use. This is very important for the best performance. Another thing to keep in mind is to use a gentle hand. If you press too hard with the acrylograph against your paper, you may get some skipping, spraying, or scratchiness, especially if you're using these on any uncoated paper or paper with tooth. If you find that there is excess ink coming out of the nib, if it's pooling, you can remove the excess by wiping the nib gently with a clean rag or a paper towel. Another thing to keep in mind is that this ink dries very quickly, so you're going to want to work quickly with it if you want to get a nice smooth finish or if you're blending. Of course, drying times will vary depending on the type of paper you're working on. A coated paper tends to have a longer drying time than an uncoated paper. Let's talk about tips for layering. One of the selling points of the acrylographs is that they are amazing for layering on top of each other, as long as you wait until the ink is completely dry on one layer before you try to add another layer. This is really the most important tip for layering with these pens. You need to wait for each layer to completely dry. Luckily, as I mentioned, the ink from the acrylographs does dry quite quickly, so this isn't a long time to wait. But to be on the safe side, wait a little bit longer and you'll find you get much nicer results. I've done a little test here to show some different variations. The first two swatches are acrylographs on top of acrylographs. The next swatch is a bunch of different pens and markers on top of an acrylograph layer. The next example is acrylographs on gouache, and the last example is acrylographs on watercolor. All of these performed well. I would recommend if you're looking to layer acrylographs on top of another paint and you're trying to choose between gouache and watercolor. I found the acrylographs went on a lot more smoothly and didn't pick up any of the pigment on the gouache, whereas on the watercolor, it seemed that the acrylograph's wetness did activate the watercolor a little, even though the watercolor had been dried overnight. So just something to keep in mind. This is more a problem with watercolor layers being really easily reactivated even after they're dry, whereas gouache takes a little bit more to reactivate. I unfortunately don't own any acrylics or other types of paints to test, but I would assume from their performance here that they would perform very well as long, again, as the first layer is completely dry. Now let's talk tips for blending. So I've done examples of 4 different types of blending here to really give you a good feel for what works best when it comes to blending acrylographs. Of course, your experience may vary, and the more that you practice with the acrylographs, the better you'll get at all of these methods. The first method I tested was blending 2 or more colors together on a palette to create a brand new shade. To do this, you're going to activate each pen and press them onto the blending palette gently, allowing the ink to flow out. Once you have a good little puddle of your colors, you're going to use the blending pen to mix them together until you get your desired shade. Once you're happy with the shade, pick up as much of it as you can onto that clear blender, not only on the tip but on the sides by rolling the nib into the shade, and then use that clear blender pen with your new shade on the nib to apply the color to the page. Now keep in mind, the blender pens have nothing in them. They are just an empty pen with a dry nib. So for this reason, you really need to get down a lot of your new color to pick up enough that it will write or fill in an area smoothly. Method number 4 is a slight variation on this method that I think works a little bit better. So hold out for that one to see another way to manage this if you're finding this blending method a little difficult. I created 2 new shades using this method. The first one, I was going for sort of a burnt orange vibe, and it's a little muddy looking, but pretty close to what I envisioned. And the second color I wanted to create was a nice deep green with a slight blue tinge, and this one turned out really nice. Now moving on to method number 2. This is the first way of creating a gradient. For this method, you apply 2 shades side by side and then use the clear blender pen to blend the shades together. This one can be quite difficult to get a smooth gradient because, as I mentioned, this ink dries very quickly. So you need to work super fast to get a smooth gradient, and it can be quite difficult unless you're doing a very, very tiny area. Another way to do this that is, in my opinion, a little easier is to blend using the colored pens themselves. It still doesn't give you a perfect gradient, but I found it a little bit easier since you're continually adding new ink that is still wet, and it gives you a little bit more leeway time for getting a nice smooth gradient. Next we have method 3, which in my opinion is the absolute best way to get a gradient with the Acrylograph pens. I would highly recommend that you use this method pretty much any time you're going for a gradient rather than the variations in method 2. So for this method, you are going to choose 2 colors that you want your gradient to move between and pick the darker color to apply to your palette. I would recommend using the 3mm pens for this because they do expel more ink more quickly, so it'll be easier for you to get a nice little puddle of ink on your palette. Once you have enough of your darker ink on the palette, you're going to pick up the color on the lighter pen. Then all you need to do is write or color on your page, and you'll see a nice smooth gradient from the darker shade all the way through to the lighter shade as the darker ink wears off. If you finish your gradient and you still notice a little bit of the darker ink on your lighter pen's nib, you can wipe it off using a clean rag or paper towel, or if you're struggling to get it off, you can remove the nib and rinse the nib in water, allow the nib to fully dry, and reinsert it into your pen. And the last method of blending I wanted to mention to you was using a brush with your acrylographs. In my opinion, this is one of the best ways to apply either a brand new mixed shade or to create a nice gradient on the page. So here's an example of creating a brand new shade. This is sort of a royal blue purple by mixing the blue and purple together from the primary set. And I'm picking up this new shade with a dry brush and applying it to the page. Now this brush I'm using is an older brush, it's fraying a little bit, so I would recommend a newer brush with a nice fine point. Another great way to use brushes with acrylographs is when you're trying to create a gradient directly on the page, as I was doing in method 2. So rather than using the clear blender pen or your colored pens to try to blend your 2 shades together once you've applied them on the page, you apply your 2 shades onto the page side by side, and then you use your dry brush to gently blend them together. You can always add a little bit more ink of either color if you need it. And in my opinion, this gradient was just as nice as the gradient we got in method 3. So those are all the different methods I tried for blending these acrylographs. As I mentioned, I really think method 3 and 4 are the easiest to use and in my opinion gave the best result. So those are the methods I'm going to personally be using in the future. If you've tried other methods that have worked for you, let us know in the comments so we can all learn new fun ways to blend our acrylographs. I did a smudge test at the bottom of the page here just to demonstrate how quickly these inks dry. As you can see, by 15 seconds they are almost completely dry, very little smudging, so you really do have a small window of time to work with the ink on the page before you're out of luck. Here are the swatches of every single shade that is currently released on white paper, craft paper, and black paper. The white, craft, and black paper are all Archer and Olive paper, which is 160 GSM uncoated paper. I also swatched a few shades on some other notebook papers, so I'll put them up here now so you can see. This is some thinner paper, both coated and uncoated. You can see that there's a lot more ghosting because the paper itself is thinner, but definitely no more significant ghosting than you would see from something like a Tombow or a Crayola marker, no bleed through, and no significant buckling or wrinkling of the page. Now let's talk through some common issues you may run into and some troubleshooting tricks you can try. The first issue you may run into would be patchiness, skipping, lack of opacity, and scratchiness. If you're not getting a smooth and opaque ink flow, there are a few things you can try. First, remember to reactivate the pen between each use. If you didn't reactivate or you didn't shake or press enough when you reactivated, there may not be enough ink in the nib to get that smooth, opaque flow. So when in doubt, reactivate. Another thing to keep in mind is the pressure you're using. If you're pressing too hard with your pen, you may get a scratchier or less even application of ink. If you can use a more gentle hand, you will get a better result. Another thing to keep in mind here is which nib is best for which purpose. The fine tip 0.7mm nib is not as well suited to covering a large area smoothly as the larger 3mm nib. So if you're trying to use the finer nib to fill a large area and you're getting some patchiness or scratchiness, lack of opacity, I would highly recommend switching over to the larger nib. You will find that you get more ink flow and you're able to fill the larger area more quickly and have a smoother finish. Another thing to keep in mind is some shades are going to be more opaque on certain types of paper. For example, black paper is more forgiving for the darker colors than the lighter colors. If a lighter color isn't running completely opaque, you're going to notice that much more easily on the black paper than you will on the craft or white paper. So in these cases, I would recommend that you finish filling whatever area you're filling, let that layer fully dry. While it's drying, make sure to really thoroughly activate the pen so you're getting a nice opaque ink flow. And once your first layer is dry, go over it with another layer and you'll find that you have a nice opaque finish. If you forget to cap your pen, you may find that the nib will dry out and your pen won't work anymore. Luckily, there's a way to fix this and I'll show you here. You can remove the nib. Again, you want to hold the pen vertically with the nib pointing up. Gently remove the nib, grab the bag that holds the replacement nibs, take the nibs out, fill that bag with a small amount of water, and place your dried out nib into the bag. Seal it up and give it a nice shake, and then leave it to soak for a while. This should simultaneously clean and rehydrate your nib. Once it's had enough time to soak, you can remove the nib, rinse it under water, and then leave it to fully dry before replacing it into your pen, and you should have no problems. If you wanted to use the pen right away, you can also replace the nib with a new nib while you're doing this whole process. And that's the great thing about each set coming with 2 extra nibs. You have a little bit of leeway there. If you need to do a little bit of a cleaning on one of your nibs, you can quickly replace the nib with something new so you can keep using your pen and you still have those 2 extra nibs. You can use this exact same method for a clogged nib. If you find that the nib seems to be clogged with ink, use this exact same method of removing the nib and cleaning it out in water in the little nib baggie, and you should find that it works nicely again. If you have a damaged nib, whether it's been flattened or it's fraying, you can use the same method to remove the damaged nib and replace it with a new one. The last troubleshooting tip I want to mention is for anyone who's experiencing a lot of ink releasing suddenly when the nib is pressed. This is more likely to happen to people in high altitude areas in hot weather because of thermal expansion and contraction, which can cause air bubbles within the ink. Regardless of where you're located and the temperature, if you're finding this is happening or you're noticing little air bubbles, the best way to handle this is to hold your pen vertically with the nib up, uncap it, turn the cap upside down, and then gently press the nib of the pen against the cap. This should release the air and your pen should work normally again. Do this over the blending pellet or a rag because you may find that some ink starts to run down the side or drips out while you're doing this. So there we have it. Those are all of my tips and troubleshooting tricks for using your Archer and Olive Acrylograph pens. I really hope that this was helpful for those of you who have these pens or are planning on getting them. Of course, if you have more questions, if there are other things you've run into that you're looking for help with, leave them in the comments down below and I'll do my best to answer them. I've been so impressed by these pens so far, and I can't wait to keep using them in my bullet journal. I love the shades that are available and the color selection. I think that these shades are so incredibly unique, especially the jewel set. This is my favorite set by far. I just love this color palette so much. Let me know in the comments down below which set has your favorite colors, because I'm really curious to know which is your favorite. And with that, we've come to the end of this video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Thank you to Archer and Olive for sponsoring this video and sending me these pens. Don't forget, if you're planning on purchasing some acrylographs from Archer and Olive, you can use my affiliate code PBB10 for 10% off. I hope this video was helpful, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends. I want to take a moment to thank my patrons for their support. Extra special thanks to our newest patrons, Liz, Bolshv, Anne, Hannah, Amy, Kelly, Jeanette, Tracy, Supeng, and Riven. Welcome all of you to the squad. We are so excited to have you. If you at home want to join the squad, feel free. There's a link in the card and in the description box down below. And if you're looking for something else to watch, I recommend you check out this video or this video.